Hola. Hola, señoritas. Señors. Señoras. I don't know the plural form of the Spanish word for man. At least. Not the plural of the of the word senor. Anyway. Today we have on the left David Pakman, and on the right Matt Walsh, and for the center we're going to do Piers Morgan. Even though we hate watching Piers Morgan these days. Alright, here we go.
If you are eligible to vote in 2026 and you are not planning to vote, I need to speak directly to you today. And the primary question is, why the F are you not planning to vote? The stakes are so high. And before anybody says, oh, David, voting in 2026 is not going to remove Donald Trump from office, I know that. I understand how presidential terms work. I've made it clear that unless Donald Trump dies, he is going to be president until January of 2029. He's not going to disappear the morning after the midterms, but that is just not the argument. Think of the 2026 election as the process of hiring the departure committee for Donald Trump. You are choosing the people who are going to oversee the final 2 years of Donald Trump's presidency. You are deciding who controls the committees, who has investigative power to look into the corruption, who has subpoenaed.
All right. We've heard enough, I think. He's just telling you that if you can vote, you should vote. It strikes me as not being super simple, but it feels more like, yes you can, yes we can type of feeling than a no you can't. Yes you can make a difference with your power. And I even agree that those who can vote should. I think that not very many people should be able to vote. But I think that if you can vote, you should vote. I'm sure it's possible to imagine a situation where you shouldn't vote, even though you can. But that would be the exception which proves the rule, in my view. I'm going to say that believing that you should vote if you can is liberal and therefore right-wing. And I also think that it's true.
You used to describe yourself as a pro of the 2026 election as the process of hiring the
Why isn't it letting me? God damn it.
Jason Arday was a serial liar, thug, narcissist, criminal, and plagiarist who quickly
Matt Walsh, ladies and gentlemen.
rose to the ranks of full professor at Cambridge, one of the most prestigious and sought-after jobs in all of academia. Arday was awarded his job as a professor of sociology of education, not because of his talent or scholarship, but because he was a black activist. He told liberal white women what they wanted to hear. Arday fabricated elaborate, obviously fraudulent narratives about how racists had oppressed him throughout his life. He also concocted bizarre stories about how masked men with knives were chasing him around campus, how he supposedly discovered a pig's head on the porch of his family home. Despite clear evidence that Arday was delusional, the leaders of Cambridge, mostly white liberal women, of course, fell in love with him on the spot. They passed over thousands of other qualified, much more qualified applicants, many of them white, in order to sell a story to the public about the virtues of DEI. Cambridge promoted Arday as a shining example of a strong black man who had overcome tremendous adversity, claimed he couldn't even read or write until he was 18 years old, and became the youngest black professor in the university's history. And then, when it all came crashing down, when Arday was exposed as the complete fraud he was, he apparently took his own life. Faced with some actual adversity for once in his life, Arday immediately opted for the coward's way out. He left his 2 children behind rather than face the consequences of his own lifelong deception. And through it all, Cambridge and many other race hustlers, including the UK's new prime minister, have stood by Arday. Many mainstream media outlets in this country have run sympathetic stories on him as well, where they suggest that his critics are responsible for his death. Jason Arday chose to lie and plagiarize, and then chose to end his life, apparently. And the only person not responsible for any of Jason Arday's disastrous decisions, we are told, is Jason Arday himself. Watch.
The death of high-profile academic Jason Arday has intensified scrutiny of the media coverage of him beforehand. Jason and
This is why, although he's a barbarian who I may have to jail someday, I love Matt Walsh dearly as a brother from the bottom of my heart, because he is singing my song. He's preaching my sermon to the deepest choirs of my heart. He's calling for society to uphold the value of the concept of free will. That it's possible to make your own decisions, and that, by definition, you are morally responsible for them. People of all kinds, to varying degrees, fall prey to the narrative and to the arguments, the false arguments, the easily disproven and debunked arguments that free will does not exist. But these people simply need to be challenged to wherever you see them. And if you cannot sufficiently challenge them yourself, you can refer them up the chain of debate command all the way to me if necessary. I promise you, I will destroy whatever arguments that they have for the case of free will not existing, because it obviously does. I won't give you the arguments here in this video because that's not what this is about. But if challenged, I'll be more than happy to provide them. Just to put a pin in this segment, the salient question is whether that is a left-wing or right-wing belief. It is clearly a right-wing belief, clearly a liberal and therefore right-wing belief, a right-wing and therefore liberal belief, because it says, yes, you can. Yes, you are a person. Yes, you do own your actions. Yes, you are responsible for the consequences. Not all the consequences of everyone's actions, not the consequences of the environmental factors. Those things have consequences, but you're not morally responsible for those consequences. You're responsible for the consequences of the decisions you make and the actions you take, the thoughts you choose to think and to not think, etc. But only yours. And the funny thing about it is that the boundary between you and other things is and will never be and has never been perfect. And so we simply have to account for the exceptions which prove the rules with a great amount of humility and self-awareness at all times. So just to recap, he's saying free will is something we need more championing of. Free will / personal responsibility, that concept specifically. And to say that and to think that is liberal and therefore right-wing. And I agree with it because it is true. It's actually my most fundamental principle that I've preached in my life so far in 31 years on this small rock that we live on. Next up, Piers Morgan. Judgment Day, ladies and gentlemen.
Plague as a weapon in the lungs that is airborne, that can be transmitted between people. There is no homeland defense against a biological attack. Civilization falls apart in essentially 6 days.
I'm very concerned about the zombie apocalypse. We go to Skid Row in the evening, and it is really the zombie apocalypse.
The outbreak in the United States of America first occurs in Skid Row.
I'm most worried about nuclear weapons. The number of other states become nuclear powered.
In the future, AI will control a swarm of drones.
It's not AI, this is real.
I've never seen anything quite like this. They genuinely look like inseparable best friends. Not since the iciest peak of the Cold War has Armageddon been such a major subject of discussion, imagination, and debate.
So boring.
The doomsday clock is closer to its symbolic midnight strike than it's ever been before. Millions will line up the next Avengers movie titled Doomsday, just as they did for the biopic on Oppenheimer's fears that he might cause it. All of this renewed fascination is not without basis. Putin's Russia walked away from a key nuclear safety treaty, conflicts roil Europe and the Middle East, where the US president glibly threatens to end civilization and launch the biggest attack since Hiroshima. The US vice president talks about nuclear suicide vests in US supermarkets. Chemical weapons are advancing at the fastest rate in human history. And the people who make AI keep trying to tell us that AI is extremely dangerous. After a comfortable generation of steady growth in prosperity and relative peace, suddenly populations everywhere are fed up and hooked on content about what is now the highest number of military conflicts since the end of the Second World War. Well, my guests tonight each have fascinating insights and predictions about this cheerful subject of global catastrophe and what could cause it. Annie Jacobson is an esteemed journalist and author of the new book, Biological War, A Scenario. Phyllis O'Brien is Professor of Strategic Studies at the University of St Andrews. His latest book is called War and Power, Who Wins Wars and Why. He's also the author of one of the most popular international substacks, Philip's Newsletter. And Zhang Suixin is the game theorist turned online YouTube superstar, Professor Zhang. Well, I couldn't think of three better people to discuss Armageddon and whether any of us will still be here this time next year to do another panel than you three. So let's go through this. I mean, Annie Jacobson, great to have you back on Uncensored.
Watching Piers Morgan.
Biological war, a scenario. So there are many ways the world could end, I guess. The nuclear one, obviously, we can come to. Many people think the pandemic was a precursor to a nefarious power getting its hands on some deadly biological warfare a tool. Others think it's AI. So there are lots of ways the world might end. There are many ways the world may survive and thrive. But let's talk about biological war, given that's the subject of your new book. I mean, to me, the pandemic taught many lessons, but one of the key ones was we got lucky, that actually it could have been a lot worse. You know, I was told by one of the professors in Oxford who did the AstraZeneca vaccine rollout that if it had been, say, a new version of the Black Death, then with a 30%, 40% casualty rate, death rate, including children, obviously it would have been immeasurably worse. So we kind of got lucky, even if it didn't feel like it. But obviously this was, you know, we don't quite know the genesis of COVID-19. It's the subject of fevered speculation. But let's assume for a moment bad people get their hands on a bad biological warfare of some kind. What would that look like? How likely is this to be happening in our lifetime?
Well, the introduction that you just relayed is essentially precisely the scenario I lay out in Biological War, a Scenario, including the use of plague as a weapon. You mentioned there was a 30% death rate on bubonic plague, which is true. That Black Death, the plague of the 14th century, killed a third to a half of Europe. But plague also has a really dark sort of uncle, and that's called pneumonic plague. That is plague in the lungs that is airborne, that can be transmitted between people. And that is the scenario I write about. And it's not science fiction. This is science fact. I tie everything in my book to historical incidents or war game planning. And we know that during the very end of the Cold War, after signing the Biological Weapons Treaty, which made having an arsenal of biological weapons illegal, this was in 1972, the Soviets began developing a super plague weapon, genetically modified to be more transmissible, to be more virulent, hard to be more virulent than 100% death rate of pneumonic plague. But they did that by tweaking the ability of antibiotics to kill plague. And that's exactly the scenario I lay out in my book. And you see in no uncertain terms precisely how civilization falls apart in essentially 6 days.
Right, and you know, how easy is this scenario in terms of it? You know, could you see somebody trying to do this in a way that could get out of control and kill everybody?
Well, maybe never mind my opinion, the journalist. Rather, let's look at the opinion of the subject matter experts who work on these issues at the Defense Department, presidential advisors, pandemic planners, all of whom I interviewed for the book. And what I learned, whereas nuclear weapons are at the far end of the threat spectrum. This is an unclassified Defense Department document. Everyone knows nuclear weapons are the most destructive. Biological weapons present the greatest overall threat in Defense Department planning, precisely because of what you mentioned, that there is a extremely low bar for entry. Unlike nuclear weapons that are controlled by a nation's command and control system, you have to have an ICBM, a submarine, a B-2 bomber. Essentially, with a biological weapon, in today's world of AI-enabled computer systems and bio, you can have a nefarious actor making a biological weapon in essentially their basement.
Fascinating and terrifying. Professor O'Brien, welcome to Uncensored. First, your reaction to what you've just heard.
Well, I mean, I think we have to take certain things very seriously. The one that I'm most worried about actually is nuclear weapons, because the way the world has worked in the last 4 years is we've basically incentivized countries to develop their own nuclear weapons. That there had been, up until, say, the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine, an assumption that nuclear threats would not be used to expand. And what we have actually seen in the last few years is that there has been regular attempts by Russia to use nuclear threats to expand the country into another one. And that means that the old system's dying. The old system that nuclear powers used to say is, you don't need nuclear weapons because we'll never use them to expand and attack you. We'll only use nuclear weapons to defend themselves. And that's gone. That world is gone because these threats are now being used to justify expansion. And moreover, the other thing that's broken down is the United States has sort of lost its mind. And the United States was a country that provided a great deal of stability. And I think only now do we understand how much stability the United States provided over the last 80 years. That's no longer the case. The United States is not a reliable partner. Europe, for instance, is not a continent that is really being protected by the U.S. nuclear umbrella anymore. And so what we will probably see in the coming years, 5 or 10 years, is a number of other states become nuclear powers. And that also, by the way, is what we're going to see in Iran, because the Trump administration is basically giving up on Iran. And so we're more likely to see that the Iranians are going to press ahead with their nuclear weapons program. So we'll go from a small number of states having nuclear weapons, and it still is a relatively small number when you look at it, to 2 or 3 times that number of states having nuclear weapons probably in the next 5 to 10 years.
Most people think they can type quickly. I thought I did too, honed by many years of editing a newspaper. Then I started using Whisper Flow. It's a groundbreaking next-generation voice-to-text tool which works in literally every app you already use. It allows me to send a full follow-up email, names, next steps, technical details, all just by talking. Instead of taking 15 minutes, it now takes me less than 30 seconds, fully formatted. Filler words gone. It even spelled the names correctly the first time. Now watch what Siri does with the exact same thing. That is the difference. And it's not just on my laptop, it works on my phone too. Walking, commuting, jogging, wherever. Whisper Flow is free to use. With my link in the description, you get 1 free month of Whisper Flow Pro with totally unlimited words and usage. Use promo code PIERS, P-I-E-R-S, in your settings on desktop. And thanks to Whisper Flow for sponsoring today's show. Right, and the problem is that you can see, like Ukraine, if they hadn't been compelled in the mid-90s to give up the nuclear capability that was on their land, albeit it was Russian, but if they hadn't been compelled to give it up, then it's highly unlikely, I think, that Russia would have invaded several years ago. Similarly, if Iran had a nuclear weapon, I'm sure this is their calculus now, it's highly unlikely the Americans and Israel would have attacked them 5 months ago. So, people have worked out, they've gamed the system and realized the best security blanket you can possibly have is your own nuclear weapon. But I would say also, Professor O'Brien, it's interesting to me that Ukraine, who've been far more indomitable perhaps in this war than many thought they would be, they are now striking with some impunity into the heart of Russia. using drones to get into Moscow and so on. And yet at the moment, there's been no sense that Russia will deploy any kind of nuclear weapon. Now, is it wishful thinking to think that this is kind of called Putin's bluff, that he would never do that because of the, immediate sense that he'd be vaporized, which is what prevents the big powers using them on each other? Or is it just, on my part, wishful thinking, and that he still might contemplate it, perhaps thinking, even if I do, no one's going to want to launch a nuclear war?
Well, that's, I think, a very astute point. What was interesting is the United States believed in 2022, 2023, that Russia might go nuclear, and really adjusted its policy, did not help Ukraine that much in the way that it could have, because it was afraid of triggering a Russian nuclear response. The Ukrainians never believed the Russians would go nuclear. So the Ukrainians have always been like, no, this is ridiculous. They can't afford to go nuclear for a number of reasons, and I don't know how technical you want me to get. But basically, the risks of going nuclear don't justify any strategic advantage. And so the Ukrainians have pressed ahead and done what they wanted, but everybody else was saying, no, you must react to the threat of Russian nuclear ones. But what we've seen is the new world shows, if you have those weapons, you get advantages. And that's the part that will be unable to walk back. Russia has had massive advantages over the last 4 to 5 years because it's had nuclear weapons. And that, from a European point of view, this is going to open up an astonishing discussion as the U.S. goes home. Is there going to be a European nuclear deterrent? Is Poland going to have its own nuclear weapons? Are Scandinavian countries going to have their own nuclear weapons? Who's going to actually protect Europe from Russia?
Yeah, Professor Zhang, welcome back to Uncensored. Always a very popular guest with our viewers. What do you think about these two things? The threat of a biological war of some kind, of the kind that Annie Jacobson laid out, or the threat of, as you see, a proliferation of nuclear weapons, that presumably the possibility of a nuclear war also proliferates?
I think both possibilities are low. Right now, I'm very concerned about the zombie apocalypse. So for the past 20 years in China, I have been criticizing China as the most corrupt, the most unequal, the most materialistic society on the planet. I've been in LA for the past 3 days, and I need to go back to China and issue an apology to the Chinese people. Being in LA for the past 3 days, it really is like setting foot on a Hollywood thriller that is a sci-fi dystopia. I was in the Pacific Palisades last night for a dinner party, and the houses there are like fortresses. These huge mansions that are guarded by private security, and which are just beautiful. I was in a $20 million mansion, and then I looked up the hill. There's a $20 million mansion. None of these people, Steven Spielberg, Adam Sandler, are neighbors. None of these people know each other. They're all in their own like self-contained universes. At the dinner party, I'm sitting next to Max Blumenthal. He says to me, "Hey, maybe we should go visit Skid Row." And I think that's the best suggestion anyone has ever asked me. So we get in a car, we go to Skid Row in the evening, and it is really the zombie apocalypse. You've got like blocks and blocks of homeless people. There's this black woman who's naked rolling around the streets. A lot of them were on drugs. And it just seems to me absurd that in the wealthiest country in the history of humanity, you could have this desperate form of poverty. At the same time, what's happening is that rather than focus on internal issues, on internal corruption, inequality, the Americans choose to fight these silly, pointless wars overseas. So I'm much more worried about internal tension, internal decay, than I am about nuclear warfare or biological warfare. I'm staying at a hotel in Santa Monica. It's a luxurious hotel. I'm literally living with real-life Ken and Barbie dolls, just beautiful people. In the evening, I go out, and it's all just homeless people. And outside my hotel room, there's this man who is homeless, who's mentally ill, and he's just shouting and cursing the entire night. Thankfully, the hotel gave us earbuds. But this is the world we're living in, where society is suffering from internal decay. And rather than confront the issue, we just put on our earbuds and put our hand in the sand and live in our fortresses. But the reality is that this eternal decay will just spread and spread, and that's a real threat to humanity today.
What is the difference then between, because I'm in LA as well, I wouldn't see it as quite as stark as you do, but I get your point. But what is the difference between, say, what you're seeing here and China at the moment?
Well, I would say just extreme individualism of the Western world. Whereas in China, we focus on family, we focus on community, so we don't really have much of a homeless problem because we think that, if our brother is suffering issues, we welcome the brother into our household and accommodate him until he gets well. But here in the United States, everyone is left to fend for himself. So if you make one mistake, maybe you're doing well, but you get sick and the healthcare bill overwhelms you. You go bankrupt. Then you're on the streets. It is atrocious to think that in a wealthy society in the world, millions of people are just being left behind. Half the country can't even afford like a $20, $50 emergency.
I'd love to comment on that, if I may.
As an American on the panel, what do you feel about this?
I mean, look, if anyone's looking for a debate, they are not going to get it from me because I completely agree with what Professor Zhang just said. And I live in Los Angeles, and I want to walk my book over to your hotel because, in essence, you just took a major thread of my book and relayed it because I address the outbreak in Los Angeles. The outbreak in the United States of America first occurs in Skid Row, precisely for the reasons that you pointed out that I wanted to point out, which is what underpins my narrative on top of being sort of a national security cautionary tale, is the fact that America today is like schizophrenic about its own reality of what is happening within its own borders. One of the shocking things that was said to me by a Defense Department official who used to war game these scenarios at the Office of Net Assessment under the very famous Andy Marshall, he said, there is no homeland defense against a biological attack or incident, which is an accident. Only something you can do to mitigate extermination. And when you think of that coupled with the scenario, the reality that Professor Zhang just painted about my own city, then you realize America has a really big problem that is only going to explode elsewhere. Precisely what your other guest said, like drawing back from its partnerships around the world. I believe this all has to do with the fact that there is this complete disconnect between reality and fantasy here in the United States. It needs to be addressed or we're circling the drain.
If I might say something?
Professor, yes, you can. I was going to bring you in, actually. I was just going to ask you, Professor O'Brien, before you respond. Well, respond first of all, then I'll put my point to you here.
Sure. I mean, for Professor Zhang, I find that was a very romantic picture of China. China is an oppressive dictatorship. And to somehow present China as that rose-colored society vis-a-vis a very messy Western society. The United States is a messy Western society. I think completely distorts the reality of between the two. I mean, China, we don't know of what's actually going on in a lot of China because it is quite a dictatorial, controlled society. So I would think that we need to step back and have a little perspective on that. I think the real problem in the West is the growth of authoritarian figures. It's because it's becoming more like China. Politically, with sort of real strong men trying to put in place their individual visions, and we don't have checks and balances like we used to. We don't have the more liberal system that we used to have. So in many ways, we're becoming more like China, and that's not a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, the question I was going to put to you was, as somebody who obviously knows his history, history is littered with seemingly unbeatable empires. Rome being a classic example, which everybody assumed would just go on bestriding the globe like this colossus, but they all end, right? And the big question, I think, for the United States is, yes, it's the greatest superpower we've seen in history, arguably, but I saw the latest debt numbers today, for example, over $40 trillion in debt, United States. Mm-hmm. These are baffling numbers to anybody who understands basic economy. How sustainable is the American business model, do you think? I mean, could America be the modern day Rome and just effectively one day we wake up and it's no longer the superpower we thought it was?
America would dream to be in Rome's financial situation. That's actually a much greater fear to me than this idea that the society will break down. Because the American debt, as indeed the debt in many countries around the world, including in China, when you look at the real estate debt, is basically unpayable now. We can't pay back the massive amounts of money that are owed. For the United States, the debt problem is structurally, it's just going to get larger. So there's no way to reduce the debt unless you completely remake government. And it's hard to see how that will happen. And you've got this structural debt that's going to grow every year, and interest rates are going up. So now they've crept up for a number of years. They're getting up to 20-year highs, what the United States is going to pay. So soon, actually right now, but increasingly, a massive part of the debt will simply be to pay the old debt. And that is going to set off a chain reaction that I am very worried about.
Professor Zhang, I mean, obviously China still owns a large chunk of American debt, which most people don't focus on, I don't think nearly enough. But in answer to Professor O'Brien's critique that, you know, China's not the, I wouldn't say you described it as utopia, because you don't, but he was pretty critical of the very oppressive dictatorship that China really is. Would you concur with that description?
Yeah, I mean, I think China is very much an authoritarian nation. And I did preface my discussion of Los Angeles by saying that for the past 20 years, I've been very critical of the corruption, inequality, and the materialism, the authoritarianism in China. I am the world's foremost critic of the Chinese school system. I've been doing so for the past 20 years, being interviewed by major publications like New York Times and Wall Street Journal, and going to education conferences, pointing out the deficiencies in China's schooling system. So I'm very much aware of the deficiencies in Chinese society. But then I go to a place like the United States, and I go to Skid Row, and never before have I seen such an apocalyptic image where, you know, you have thousands of citizens of the world's most prosperous society, and they're just being left to their own devices. The state has abandoned them. And as Annie Jacobson has pointed out, this will be ground zero for any epidemic, because these places are rife with contagious diseases. And so contagious diseases, biological warfare happens not when, you know, society develops a biological superweapon. It happens when society neglects basic sanitation. That's what's happening in American society today. Just because I point out basic problems in American society does not mean I am a communist. And also, when you say that the real problem is authoritarian figures, let's remember back in 2016 how Donald Trump came to power in the first place. It was because in 2008, Barack Obama was brought into power with the slogan of hope and change. At this point, the Wall Street bankers had criminally bankrupted the American financial system, and millions of homeowners were about to lose their houses. And Barack Obama was brought in because people believed that this would be a revolution. Instead, Barack Obama appointed Goldman Sachs executives, people such as Larry Summers, Tim Geithner, and Bob Rubin, and they bailed out their friends on Wall Street. Surprise, surprise. And millions of homeowners were bankrupted. So everything that's happening today is because of Barack Obama's policies, not because of Donald Trump. Donald Trump was brought into power as a response to people's frustration with the meritocracy, with the elite, with the callousness of the American elite.
Annie Jacobson, there are lots of different... First of all, respond to that if you want, then I'll ask you a question.
Well, I just think it's important to lay down a few facts here, because I think the problem for me as a narrative storyteller is that if you can't deal with the problems that are happening, if your own house is not in order, the United States of America, how can you project authority overseas? It's essentially sort of hollow. It's hypocritical. Facts and figures on the homeless issue in Los Angeles and why it's so dangerous to something like a biological incident, that would be a lab leak or an attack. There are 4,000 people that Professor Zhang described running around down there on Skid Row. 4,000. All of them are either mentally ill, physically ill, or a combination of both. I interviewed epidemiologists who work there, have told me that the homeless population in America is an extraordinary national security problem. Here's why. There are 800,000 homeless people in the United States for reasons of economics, for reasons of, sanity, of like treat your neighbor well, all those reasons are extremely important in and of their own. But from a biological sort of warfare standpoint, what's interesting is that the government, and this is a metaphor, so stay with me here, the government has spent billions and billions and billions of dollars since 9/11 building up BSL 3 and 4 labs, building up what is called a syndromic surveillance system. We have 7,000 ERs across America that feed data in real time to the CDC so that we can get in on top of an outbreak if it happens. But guess who is left out of that entirely? The 800,000 person homeless population, the most vulnerable way in. And the point that I'm making here is that enemies and adversaries know this. They actually spend a lot of time looking at America's weaknesses. Why isn't America, the average person, willing to see their own problems right in front of them?
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. Professor O'Brien, you look across the globe at the moment, there are lots of potential flashpoints that could trigger, a third world war of some kind. In fact, President Zelensky in Ukraine has started using that phrase as if it's already kind of happening. I read today that thousands more North Korean troops, for example, are going to be pouring in to Ukraine to fight with the Russians. You see with the situation in Iran that China and Russia and other actors are exploiting what the Iranians are doing with the Strait of Hormuz. You still have the ongoing issues with Israel and Gaza and Lebanon. You've got the Houthis and Yemen and Saudi. You've got the potential for China and Taiwan, of course, lurking in the background. Any one of these, it seems to me, could, if we're unlucky, through either deliberate malpractice or through an accident, could trigger something really alarming. If my son's an actor. He recently played the young man who triggered the start of First World War in a play in London, Guerrilla, right? And it just happened by chance, right? The Archduke happened to go to this particular sandwich store and he killed him, and it spiraled into World War One. These things can happen on a tiny trigger. And it got me thinking about where we are with all these things. When you look at all the current areas of conflict, what are you most worried about?
Well, one quick thing. We have had a pandemic in the last few years, and it didn't come out of Los Angeles. And so we have to be somewhat careful about picking out the homeless population of Los Angeles and say, aha, pandemic will arrive there. We have had a global pandemic. It didn't come from there. And indeed, something like Ebola did not come from there. So I would just let
the pandemic, and it doesn't start in Los Angeles at all. It comes from Russia, just FYI. Yeah. I'm just talking about where it seeds into the population, and also COVID had a 1%.
Russia to Los Angeles, it's already seeded.
Of course. But I'm just pointing out the reality. That's all.
The population of Los Angeles. That just seems to me picking a strange population and saying because something's developed in Russia, because there's homeless people in Los Angeles, it'll become a pandemic. If it's already reached Los Angeles, it's reached populations in London and New York and everywhere else.
That's not. You should read my book before you decide what it says. But anyways, I'm happy to say.
But pointing out the population in terms of the war, absolutely. I think we have to look at the population. The chance of war is going up, and it's primarily because the United States is in relative decline. We lived in an American-dominated world from 1945. That the United States was the world superpower. It was 25-30% of the world economy. It was by far the most militarily powerful state in the world. It is no longer dominant economically in the way that it was. China has risen. Other states have risen. So the United States economic edge is not what it was. It's weakened its own military a lot, particularly in the last few months, but then also in the last 20 years. It's weakened itself diplomatically because it's offended a lot of its allies and insulted a lot of its allies. And what that means is the American-led bloc, which really controlled much of the world for the past 80 years, is no longer there. And with that American-led bloc weakened, then the chance of wars breaking out across the globe are much, much higher. Because there is no stability. The American system is over. Where the next war will come about, who knows? But all we know is it's unable. There's not going to be some sort of trying to be controlling system to keep that war from happening. And that means war is going to be a much greater part of our lives, I would say.
Professor Zhang, it is very likely that modern warfare going forward is going to be pretty much entirely automated, I would have thought. And in 20 years' time, the idea you would use human forces seems very anachronistic, given what we're already seeing now in terms of the way the Iranians have been conducting themselves, in terms of the way Ukraine has deployed drones and so on. Do you see a world where within 20 years we cease to see human troops on the ground, for example?
Yeah, it is possible. You're absolutely right. So companies like Palantir are developing autonomous drone weapon systems. So you can imagine, the war in Ukraine, where in the future, AI will control a swarm of drones and they will be able to overwhelm enemy forces. And I think this technology already exists and they're already testing it out in the battlefield of Ukraine. And this could become the face of future warfare. And I think that the real threat to humanity is not the threat from without, but the threat from within, basically the breakdown of social contract. So as war spreads throughout the world, then there will be famine issues throughout the world as well. And you can imagine tens of millions of migrants trying to flee into Western societies. So, for example, a couple weekends ago, there was this 50,000 military-age invasion of Ceuta, which is the Spanish enclave on the African continent. So basically the Moroccans just let in 50,000 young men into Ceuta, and it seemed coordinated. It seemed it seemed a new way of warfare, like hybrid warfare. I think we'll see much more of this in the future. Let me respond to Professor O'Brien's point about Los Angeles. The issue isn't homelessness. The issue is the breakdown of the social contract. So I was walking around yesterday, and I'm in Santa Monica. I'm not sure where Annie Jacobson is. I would love to meet you if you're in Santa Monica. But I was walking around. It's like the most beautiful place you could ever be, and just these gorgeous neighborhoods. And then, like, as I'm walking on the pavement, there's this pile of dog shit, and I was surprised by it. I walked around it. It took me a couple of minutes before I realized that it did not come from a dog. Okay, so imagine a society where people feel they can just sit on the pavement and take a dump and not care, and then people around them don't even care as well. We're seeing a breakdown of the social contract, and when that happens, then whenever a crisis happens, then it's very easy for people to become tribalistic and to start to kill each other. So I think civil strife will be a very dominant issue over the next 5 years.
Yeah, it's interesting, Annie. I've lived and worked on and off in LA for 20 years, and I often tell people who tell me where should I go in LA. I say, well, look, before dusk I would go to the beaches, right? Santa Monica, Venice Beach. They're fantastic fun during the day. I wouldn't go there once it gets dark. Right. In other words, there is literally a dark side to LA, as there is to many American cities. The two things we haven't really touched on here, we've got to draw things to a slight close, but the doomsday clock is at 7 minutes to midnight, the closest it's ever been. We haven't really mentioned much on AI and the impending threat of it getting out of our control and then beginning to self-design, something that Professor Stephen Hawking told me before he died would be the end of the world if that happened. I think we're getting very close to that moment. And secondly, climate change. This is the hottest I've known LA in the 20 years I've been here. Local Angelinos say the same. In England, we're about to have our 5th heat wave this summer. I can tell you that is completely unprecedented. And the temperature's got over 100 degrees several times. So climate change is real. I know that simply from the places that I occupy during a year. So we haven't mentioned that either. Many people think that may be the biggest threat of all. So Annie, let's take this doomsday clock to midnight. What do you believe actually is the greatest threat to mankind?
Well, right now we are absolutely living in a moment where global catastrophic risk is extraordinarily real, whether it's bio, nuclear, AI enabled bio or AI enabled self design, these are very serious risks. They're actually called in Defense Department planning near extinction level events, near ELEs. This is not fantasy. This is not science fiction. It is here. It is now. My first 6 books are history. My present book and the one before on nuclear are scenarios about what might happen. They are meant to be cautionary tales. The point is not panic as much as it is pressure. We have to start applying pressure, guardrails, oversight, accountabilities to all of these existential risks and pay attention to what is absolutely in front of us, or we will have your Stephen Hawking prediction, Piers. I really fear for that.
Yeah, Professor O'Brien, I mean, we talk about MAD, mutually assured destruction, as being the reason there may not be a nuclear war, and it has a lot of validity to that in terms of a concept. But if it's climate change or if it's AI, then that concept doesn't exist, right? I mean, if the robots get control and decide to kill us all, that's it. If climate change is as bad and is as aggressive as many scientists think it is, and weather patterns seem to suggest it's getting worse, then you could see that becoming the big threat. What do you think, quickly, is the biggest threat of all?
Well, I mean, I think you hit Two. One on climate change. The frightening thing is we've, I think, decided simply to live with it. And we've given up attempts to stop it at this point, and it seems to be accelerating. And the issue that faces is that, therefore, the present geographical distribution of population on the Earth will become impossible to sustain, because certain parts that had large populations, do have large populations now, won't be able to produce food. They'll become very difficult to sustain human life, and that you will have massive pressure for population movement that could cause chaos. So I would say, in terms of global warming and the planet heating up, which we are experiencing, that's a real tripwire if you start making large parts of the world uninhabitable because they simply get too hot. In terms of AI, the issue we face is 5 years ago, everyone was saying, Pentagon was saying, there will always be a human in the loop when it comes time to making a decision. No one's saying that quite as loudly anymore. And that is because they see certain military advantages for automating a system. And if the system can make its own mind up, it can act quicker. And if that military advantage is considered so important that you need more automated systems to make more automated decisions, not being slowed down by a human being, then we are on, I think, a very difficult and slippery slope that will be hard to stop, because everyone will want to automate everything. And you end up with, as Professor Zhang said, an automated army.
Professor Zhang, very quickly, because we've run out of time, what do you think is the biggest threat to mankind right now?
I think we're living in the age of the Silicon Age collapse, which is very similar to the Bronze Age collapse. If you look at the year 1000 BCE, when all civilization collapsed, what we know is that it was not one crisis, it was a perfect storm of crises. So all these things we mentioned, including biological warfare, homelessness, armed warfare, AI, climate change, it's all happening at once, and our society is on the brink. This is not World War III. This is the collapse of civilization.
Fascinating. Well, what a great debate. Thank you all very much indeed. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
We're after a big debate about the apocalypse. I wanted to go into my summer break on a happier note. I couldn't find much to smile about while scouring the news headlines this week until I came across the story of Barney and Louie, a stricken golden retriever suffering with dog depression, and the best friend who's nursing him back to health, and also happens to be a duck. Well, millions around the world have watched videos of Barney and Louie this week, and alongside their owner, Tori Canarelli, they join me now. Well, welcome to all three of you.
Hi, thank you for having us.
Yeah.
We're happy that you're sharing.
It's the most boring shit of all time, I swear to God. Holy shit. As far as I'm concerned, he said nothing of any relevance in that entire video as far as his opinion goes. Maybe that's not true, but
You lied to your teeth and then you said fuck Israel.
Fuck Israel, fuck the genocide going on.
He attacked me in a hate crime.
I never touched him in the video.
Are you seriously inverting this story from a Jewish victim of a hate crime?
It shows the character of this man, and it shows that he will go at any length to get views.
You are a dangerous man, and I will never tell you. God forbid. That just shows his intentions.
Let me tell you
now
something.
you see his intentions.
Fascism is immoral, but you have to acknowledge economically can yield some results. So it's immoral, but sometimes it works. If I have to choose Mamdani or Pinochet, I'll go Pinochet. If it's AOC or Pinochet, maybe I'd blow my head off.
The rabbi and activist Shmuley Boteach was at the center of a firestorm again this week after chasing down an Icelandic couple who interrupted his vacation on the volcanic island. Shmuley says that Samuel Gudmundsson posed as a fan who wanted a selfie before surprising him with a political message, or the words "fuck Israel" to be exact. The rabbi posted a video in which he followed Gudmundsson and his girlfriend through the streets. He accused them of anti-Semitism and vowed to press charges.
I told you I was on the phone. I told you I didn't want to interrupt, and you said you said about Rashuli, you said that you were a big fan. You lied through your teeth, and then you said fuck Israel. Why would you do that?
How many times? Fuck Israel.
Okay,
Fuck Israel. Fuck the genocide going on. Fuck. I will.
Nothing to do with that, and you know it. Let him
History will not favor the genocide that you are behind. Okay.
What do you mean she has nothing to do with it?
We have freedom of speech. We have freedom of speech.
You do.
We have freedom of speech. Fuck Israel. I will say fuck Israel the whole day. This is my country. Welcome to my country.
This is the face of hatred, anti-Semitism. It's the face of Jew hatred. It's the face of what we've faced for 2,000 years.
Well, Shmuley's vigilante gambit has so far mostly backfired in the court of public opinion. The statement, fuck Israel, is considered rude in Iceland, but it's not illegal. Iceland's government takes a hardline stance on the Gaza war. It was among the first to join the genocide and war crimes case against Israel and Netanyahu in the International Criminal Court. It has recognized a sovereign Palestinian state at the UN since 2011, and some in the country have praised Samuel Gudmundsson for his Nordic stoicism. Well, he joins me now. Samuel Gudmundsson, welcome to Uncensored.
Thank you very much for having me, Piers. It's a pleasure.
Well, it's good to have you. This story's got a lot of attention, not just in Iceland.
Okay, so this coward, Piers Morgan, is hosting this Jew-hating racist, apparently, because they both think that Israel is committing a genocide. I would like them to define genocide, and if they use that in whole or in part bullshit, I would just like them to explain how that's possible. Anyway, it's not true that it's a genocide. If you just look at the reasonable definitions of genocide, it's not true. And thinking that it is true, thinking that it is true is left-wing, and therefore conservative, or rather, conservative and therefore left-wing. It tells you or is it? Maybe it is like a yes I can call it genocide thing, in which case I would say that it's more liberal and more on the right to believe that generally to believe in a wrong definition of a word is the liberal thing to do. Yeah, because what me and people like me would say is, no, you can't use that word to mean that thing. It's too different from that other way that you're using that word to mean that other thing. They're saying, yes, I can use the word to mean whatever I want, essentially. And for that reason, I'm going to call it a liberal belief and therefore a right-wing belief. But I do not agree with it. I hold the conservative end of that stick, because in my view it's the correct end on that stick for that particular stick. And fuck you again, Piers Morgan, for being so goddamn boring in the first video. You literally put me to sleep, and I was forced to click a second video. You are the first person so far, and potentially are going to be the only person ever to force me to click a second video in order to get one fucking worthwhile opinion out of their ass. So there you go. That's what kind of trash Piers Morgan is and produces. And God bless him, though. God bless his heart. Anyway, God loves you. I love you. Have a great day. It'll be another great Judgment Day tomorrow.